Alright, welcome back for part 2 today, and that's going to be about lighting. We have our ray gun here is fully materialized. No textures, as I said, we're going to be skipping over that for now, but this is the material with very boring lighting on it. So now what I want to do is focus on getting some interesting lighting to help make this look as appealing as possible. So I'm going to jump into material preview so I'm not rendering in the background. Turn that back on. The first thing I want to do is just kind of look at some examples of product lighting and product photography. Part of the point of this project is to create a short kind of sequence that would show off the product and almost think of it as like a sales tool, something that would encourage somebody to buy that product. So we've got a number of examples here. A lot of them tend to be dramatic because we're trying to add interest. So we've got a camera, which is, as you're looking at these, there's a number of things to consider. There's what is the environment that the object is in. In this case, it's a black void with a slightly reflective ground plane. And then what is the lighting? What is the color of the light? What is the quality of light? Is it soft? Is it a hard light? Are there hard shadows, or are they more diffuse? What is the directionality of the light? In this case, it's coming from above and a little bit behind. But it's still a relatively soft light and just kind of showing the contours of the object. Think about what are the interesting parts of your object, and then how can you use light, where can you place a light to accentuate or show those off. There's a lot of really interesting car photography, and cars can be rather difficult to light and shoot in real life, and 3D as well. But here we've got a big soft top-down light, and then there's no bounce, there's no fill. Some of this is probably post-processing as well. There's some weirdness going on here that might actually be colorized after the fact, but it is at least on top of a photograph of an actual car. Again, it's showing off the contours of the car. It doesn't have to show the whole thing all at once. As you're doing this too, think about how this is going to work in sequence. So you might start only showing a little bit in a few different shots, and then by the end of your sequence, then maybe the lights all come up and you've got a nice kind of final beauty shot of the whole product. Again, this is using light to isolate various areas of your object. You can play around with colored backgrounds. The object can be floating in the air and you see that kind of subtle shadow. We'll talk about ways that you could achieve this, both in Blender and in Photoshop. Colored backgrounds. You can see there's a hard line between the ground and the back wall, but similar in tone. You can play around with the shape of light. It doesn't have to just be kind of undefined, soft, somewhat directional light. You can have hard light, hard shadows. Think about what this would look like if that light was kind of moving across that window opening and the shadow was moving across it. It could be a really cool way to reveal your product. These are simple backgrounds, but they still add interest while not detracting from the focus of the image. As maybe a more traditional one, primarily a big soft source coming from frame left. We've got a reflective floor. There is some fill light. There's probably a top light as well. Alright, this is very soft light. It's not doing a whole lot, but by way of adding interest. But we've got a soft background that's just a curved flat. Would be called a cyc or a cyclorama. There's a subtle reflection here on the floor. You can see the shadow. And the product is staged in a way that is indicating motion. Alright, this is a dynamic pose. If it was already attached, it would just be kind of a static shot. By the fact that this is half on, it indicates that it is in the process of either being added or removed from the switch. Think about different angles. It doesn't have to be just front on. It can be top down, and all we're seeing is the floor. can tends to be pretty monochrome, but you can either play with similar colors or complementary colors, contrasting colors. Here's a really hard reflection. This is maybe a little bit busy, but we've got some side lighting and a really hard reflection in a black void. So a number of things to consider there, and part of your homework for next week is going to be to start lighting your scene, so I will take a look and offer my own thoughts and critique as we go. So let's get into it. And in order to set up for some lighting, I'm just going to go into solid view for now. The first thing that I want to do, I'm going to go into actually wireframe. I'm going to select not yet. Shift C to center my cursor. Shift A to add an empty and a circle. And I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees around the x-axis. So it's just laying on the ground. I'm going to go into my empty options. I'm going to change this to like 3 meters. That works. Actually, I'm not going to rotate that, so I'm going to hit Alt-R to clear the rotation. Maybe go 2.5. Just enough that it kind of contains everything. Now I'm going to select everything. And you can see that the empty is selected last. That's the active object, so I can hit Control-P, set parent to object, keep transform. So now, I did that so that I can move this empty around. Everything, whoops, almost everything will follow it. You can see there's some issues with the rivets. We can fix that here in a second. That's because I have the array modifiers on them and I haven't applied them. So I'm going to click Apply on all of those. Anything that has... Actually, I'm going to undo that. And you can see I've got all of these empties in here. I'm going to just parent those as well. So now they will follow. There. And now they're still, the modifiers are still there, so it's still editable if I need to. But now I can just select this one empty, and I'll call this ray gun parent, and everything will go with it. So I can rotate this around, move it into whatever position I want, and then if I decide I don't like it, all I have to do is select that empty, Alt-R to clear rotation. You can also go up to Object and Clear Rotation, and it'll go back to where it was. Okay, so that just gives me a little bit of extra control. I'm also going to add a camera to this scene, so Shift-A, add camera, and I'm going to move my viewport to something like this. I'll go to View, Cameras, Align View, Align Active Camera to View. Control-Alt-0, number pad 0 is the shortcut. But align Active Camera to View. The camera snaps in. I'm going to hit N and go to my View Options, Lock Camera to View. I'm going to zoom in here for a second. Lock Camera to View, and I can just kind of move it around. I'm just going to give it a wide shot. Probably not going to work with it too much, but just so that I can then hit Render and actually see something. So that's there. I'm going to uncheck Lock Camera to View, hit N, hide that. I'm actually going to hide the camera for now as well. Alright, so we need to figure out what we want this to look like. And I think the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a ground plane. Just going to plane, I'll call this ground. Go into edit mode, scale it up quite a bit. Something like that will work. I'm going to select this, and I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees on the x-axis. Whoop. I want to go that way. I'm going to go into side view, and I'm going to move it up, kind of rotate it down so that's like sitting on the ground. So this is one option. If you wanted to have it floating in the air, you could do that. Okay, so I have this point on the ground where I want it, so I'm going to shift right click at where it's touching, hit number, or not number pad period, hit period, the one that's next to the question mark on the keyboard, and I'm going to set my rotation point or my pivot point to the 3D cursor. You can also do that by going up to View. I never remember where this actually is in the menu. Let's see, Object. That's right, it's up here in the top center. So set your pivot point. I want it to be at the 3D cursor. I've also had this little widget popped up, so I'm going to hide that real quick. Okay. So once I have it set there, I can now rotate from the side view, hold down Shift, get a little bit more control, and do something like that. Okay. So we'll say it's sitting like that, and maybe I was just thinking I might want it actually rotated. Go back to medium point. I'll do something like that. It's kind of somewhat more interesting. And the top view will rotate this around a little bit, maybe. You can play around with it. Okay, so that's more or less in position. And I'll show you a few different options for kind of how to set up this scene. So I'm going to grab my ground plane. And the first is if we were just doing like a top-down shot. Okay. So, yeah, if we just do the top-down look, that's one option. I'm going to duplicate that ground plane, hide the original, and go into edit mode on the new one. I'm going to select this back edge, move it over, and then from the side view here, I'm going to extrude it up a few times, something like that. Okay. And we're going to add a subsurface modifier to it. We'll increase the something like that. And then we need to add some subdivisions, just so that when the when Blender tries to figure out what the light is supposed to look like, it's got a little bit more detail. And we'll add a few more here. And then object mode, shade smooth. Okay, and so now we have this kind of infinity backdrop. So that's another thing we can play with, and it also looks like, and that got weird. Let's not do that. There we go. Okay. So there's another option. A third option, if we go back to our original ground plane and duplicate it. I'm going to hide the original, go to the duplicate, tab in edit mode. I'm going to scale this in half, and we'll duplicate this one more time, rotate it 90 degrees, and move it back the y-axis so we look something like this. Okay, this will allow us to give some light from underneath, and it'll kind of look like something like this. It'll allow for this sort of lighting situation. So we've got that option. You know, you could do a hard angle there as well if you didn't want to have that gap. You know, there was that one with the boxes. If you want to do something like that, there are all sorts of options there. I think we'll stick with this one for now, and we can move into lighting. So for lighting, Blender doesn't have a ton of options for lighting. It's somewhere where it's lacking, and I know they're working on bringing some of that functionality back. But for now, we have 4, maybe 5 things that we can work with. If we hit Shift A and go to Light, we have Point, Sun, Spot, and Area. And I know I've talked about these a little bit. There's also, you can add some emission to a material, but I wouldn't rely on that to really put out a whole lot of light. So we'll start with, I'm not going to probably use any sunlights because they're way too broad. I also don't want to use any environment textures or HDRI images. I want to have a little bit more specific control over my lighting. So we're really going to be focusing on spot and area. We might use point here and there. But I'm going to start with a spotlight. And I'm going to move it up a little bit, GZ. And then in the top view, I'm going to move it all the way over here. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I could just double tap R and rotate this around and point this wherever I want it. I like to have a little bit more control over it though. So I'm going to add in another empty. I'm going to do plain axis. And I'm going to call this empty, we'll call this spotlight underscore target. Okay. And I'm going to move this up a little bit so we can see it a little better. Now I'm going to select the light. And I'm going to go to this, let's see, it is right here. Object Constraint Properties. That's the second blue tab. I'm going to add a Track 2 constraint. I'm going to set my target to be the spotlight target. And then we need to set the 2 is going to be -Z, and we'll go Y up. Okay? So -Z and Y up. And now, wherever we move this empty, the light is going to point at, which is great in and of itself, but it also means that this works the other way, is I can move this light wherever I want, and it's always going to point at my object. So when I move it, I don't have to move it, then rotate it back to pointing at the object, and then move it, and then rotate it again. It just speeds up the workflow quite a bit. You do also have an influence that you can adjust. You can also animate, but we'll get to that later, in probably a couple weeks. So back to my light properties. Okay, so we have color, we have power, and then for spotlight we also have the size, spot shape, and blend. So just want to make sure I'm in cycles. So in order to really properly evaluate this, we could go to Material Preview, and then we come up here and turn on Scene Lights and Scene World. You'll get a sense of it. We need to increase the power. So I'm going to start by just going straight to 100 watts. And not really doing a whole lot there. Let's add another 0. See what we get. There we go. Okay. So that's something. I mean, that already looks kind of cool just because it's really moody and theatrical. So we can adjust the size, which is going to soften the shadows. Bring the size down. It's going to make those harder shadows. So we go all the way down to 0. Those are going to be really hard shadows. Max bounces is kind of a quality thing. And spot shape. So the angle, I can go like a really tight spotlight if I wanted to. And then the blend is if you look at the edge here, the blend is going to be kind of how soft is that edge. Okay, something like that maybe. So I'm going to move my spotlight down. And then I'm going to go back here. I want to grab my empty. And I'm going to move my empty kind of over here. Okay. There we go. And so this is where lighting, especially when you're going for like individual shots like this to show off a product, you also need to keep in mind where that camera is going to be. So what you might want to do is set up multiple light groups. So I'm going to select this with the empty and the light. I'm going to hit M to create a new collection, and I'm going to call this light set 1. Okay, so this might be for the first shot, or at least it's just the first option for me to try. Click OK. And so we can start to kind of figure out where that camera might be good. All right, maybe we're going to zoom in here really close. Think about how is the camera going to move, and if the light's going to move, how is that going to move? And then we can also go up to the rendered preview and take a look. Now, we need to go back up to our render options here and turn on scene world. So now it's only using what we tell it to use. And you can kind of get a sense. Anytime the light is behind the object shooting towards the camera, you're going to get this kind of backlight rim light, which is suitably dramatic and often interesting. Okay, you can also see that shadow is going to be hitting the floor a little bit. You can also think, I'm going to go into material preview because it's a little bit faster here. But then you can think about, with this light, come on, there it goes. Think about what it looks like when it moves. So I just move this light from left to right. Okay, something like that. And it might not look good from this angle, but if we zoom in like right here and then move this light across, that right there is a really interesting moment. Okay, it's almost abstract because everything else is in black. You just see the kind of the highlights playing across it. So that's one option that you have for lights. We go with kind of a softer feel as well. So Shift C to center my cursor. So these got moved over to the side. I don't know why. Okay. So I'm going to add in a new light. This will be an area. And here's another really simple option. Again, this would be more for like a final shot than the first few shots, because this is a more general thing. I guess depending on how you light it, but I'm just going to move that up, set that to 100 again. Okay, and we can play around with the size here. So if we want it to be square, let's play around with that size. Now the material preview, the shadows don't look great, so if we go into render view, we'll get a better sense of what that's going to look like. Okay, so think about where your reflections are, where your hotspots are, and where your shadows are, and you can adjust the light accordingly. So we can kind of move this back if we want. Okay, and again, it's what angle you're looking at. It's really moody if you look at it from the opposite side of the light. If we look at it from the same side of the light, it's a lot less moody. Okay. So we can do something like that. We can change this to a more rectangular shape. And do something like that. Okay. I don't know why this is jumping around so much. Must have just had other things selected. Okay. So we do something like that. And we'll just move that to light set 2. Okay. I'm going to do another thing here, just to make my life easier. On a frame 1, I'm going to select my ray gun parent and hit I to insert a keyframe for location and rotation. Okay, so that will always go back to there. And I'm going to move forward 10 frames. Hit Alt-R to clear the rotation. And then move this up so it's kind of floating in air. Hit I and set a location rotation keyframe. So now, if I want to render this view, I just have to jump to that frame. Okay, so we've got some options there. And as you're thinking about this too, not just camera animation and light animation, you can animate your object as well. It doesn't have to be overt, it can be kind of subtle. It could just be like, with this gauge, maybe bring this up a little bit so we can see. maybe I want to animate the needle on the gauge rotating. Okay, it doesn't have to be this huge thing. Whoa. There we go. But that's an option too. I'm going to duplicate this. I'm going to move it to a new light set. Okay, I'm going to hide the other one. I'm going to rotate this 180 degrees and move it down. Okay, so now we've got this underlight going on. Alright, a lot of options there. I'm just trying to show you a bunch of different options that you have when you're lighting products like this. You can also do something a little bit more traditional. We'll go like this. Top down. I'm going to rotate this a little bit. Kind of move this over here. Alright. And I'm going to duplicate that. Rotate it a little bit. Move that over here. Actually, I'm going to go a little bit more extreme with this. Okay. Something like that maybe. And then I'm going to add in a spotlight. And from the side view, I'm going to bring it up over here. I'm going to rotate it like that. I'm going to go 2000 on that value. Okay. So now we've got this nice kind of rim light going on. And now we can bring this background into play too. Generally you want to light the background separate from the object. Just gives you a little bit more control. So I've got this background all the way back here. I'm going to Shift S and cursor to selected. And I'm going to add in an area light. Okay. I'm going to rotate it 180 degrees around the x-axis. And side view, I'm going to bring it down. Alright, I'm going to make this a rectangle. I'm going to set the X size to like maybe 20. It might be too much, maybe 10. The Y to 2. And we'll set the power. We'll start it at 1000 and see what it looks like. Okay. So let's go. There we go. Okay, so now if we think about where's our camera going to be. Alright, I'm going to hit number pad 0 to go to my camera view. Hit N to go up to set lock camera to view. Oh, there we go. There we go. Just like that, so the camera rotates around it. So maybe something like that. And we will, if you click this button right up here, show overlays, all that crap's going to go away. And now we have this really lovely view. And we can go up to the rendered view and see what that's going to look like when it renders. And we're getting a lot of bounce from this ground plane. So one thing you might want to do is select that ground plane. We need to give it a material. We should actually give all of this a material, but click new on that. And we'll call this ground to, I have to call it matte, we know it's a material. Bring that base color down. I'm going to make it a little bit more diffuse. Okay, something like that. You can make it really shiny if you wanted to. Although I've got it framed out right now, but you can see even in the background how taking that roughness all the way down, it becomes more of a mirror-like reflection. But we still get a sense of space there. Whereas if I start bringing that roughness up, now it's a harder line. Okay. Also, by giving it a material and making it darker, we're cutting down the reflection, or bouncing back up, which brings that contrast back in. Keeps it a little bit more interesting. Okay. We need to also move the spotlight to our third light group. Okay, I'm going to split this view here, just so we can work on the lights and still see the rendered view. Oops. I'm going to hit N and turn off lock camera to view. Okay. And hit N over here as well. There we go. Alright. So now, we can turn our overlays back on in this view. We can also play around with color. So, you can do kind of the traditional warm, cool contrast. Maybe there's something a little bit bluer over here. I'm almost going to up the power here. Let's go to 500. 300. And then over here, we can make this a little bit warmer. Come on. There we go. Okay. That's maybe a little bit too overt. We could, going back to that 80s thing, can maybe go really kind of teal over here, and then go just, you know, do something like that. Could be kind of cool. We can also, if we select our empty here, snap the cursor to it, and then set our pivot point to the 3D cursor. From the front view, I can rotate this kind of around so it's more underneath. And then we need to bring it up and bring it in a little bit. But now we're getting some underlighting going on. Maybe I want to take this and up this a little bit too. Okay. Maybe from the side I want to rotate this down a little bit. Kind of see how that's pushing the shadow on the floor, and also adjusting what this highlight looks like. Okay. So there's a bunch of different options there. I'm going to go ahead and save that. And I think the last thing I want to show is just how to get that really subtle kind of shadow look with Photoshop. Actually, no, there's two more things that I want to show. Alright, so that's light set 3, which I really like. But let's try to replicate this shot, which is something that I encourage you to do as well. If you find a shot you like, just try to copy it. It's really good practice to both analyze lighting in a photo, and then also to execute it in Blender, or if you're working on set in real life. So this is what we're going to try to copy. So I'm going to duplicate that, hide 2 and 3, take this, go to edit mode, select this back edge, and just extrude it up, something like that, and we can move it forward. I'll do something like that. Doesn't need to be that large. Oh, we also need to move this into light set 3. Okay. So do something like that, and then I'm gonna just add some edge loops. Just to help with the light rendering. Alright. So now let's go to frame 20, select this, and we'll position it. So I'm going to, from the front view, let's rotate it over a little bit, something like, let's see, something like that should be pretty close. Okay, so we've got this one where we want it. So I'll put the 3D cursor there, and then we will rotate it down so that's touching. I'm going to come around to the side view here. This is actually going to be maybe a little tricky to see. Let's rotate around the around the x-axis until it's just touching that wall. Looks like right about there is going to be pretty good. Okay. You can always adjust that later, but for now I'm going to just put that keyframe there. And the first thing we need to do is we need to add that light source. So I'm going to add a spotlight, move it up. I'm going to hit M, a new collection. We'll call this light set 4, excuse me. Click OK. And I'm also going to hit Shift A, add in an empty plane axis. Hit F2 to rename it. We'll call it empty light spotlight 4. Move this up. Click on the empty. Go to constraints. Track to -Z and Y. Target is empty spotlight 4. Okay. So now I can take this and move it out over here. And we need to give it some power. So let's set the power to, what, 1,000 maybe. And I don't know where our camera is. The camera, I'm also going to go to frame 10 on the camera. Oh, unhide it. Go to frame 10, hit I, location, rotation, and I'll go to frame 20. And alright, we'll put it maybe something like that. So it's Control Alt number pad 0 is the shortcut for align active camera to view. And then let's hit N here, lock camera to view, and finalize this framing, something like that. Okay. That'll work. So hit N again, turn that off. Alright. So you can see this spotlight's not doing a ton. So let's crank that up to like 5,000. Set the size to 0 so we get really hard shadows. Alright, we're going to go even higher. We're going to go to 10,000. And we're going to bring that size in. Okay. And let's move this in the Y direction. Move that down a little bit. Really drive that shadow. Let's see, where do I want the shadow? I'll do something like that. I'm also going to double that intensity again. Okay, so let's say that that's where we want the light. Now, we don't want this round kind of edge. We want to go, I'm also going to bring that blend down. We want a harder edge. So the way we're going to do that is with some additional geometry. So I'm going to snap the cursor to the light, and I'm going to add in a plane. I'm going to call this light set 4 cutout. You could also call it a cookie for cuclors, to the lighting term. But I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees. Okay. And we'll move it to the side here. Move it kind of here-ish, I think. Go into edit mode. Scale it up. Oops. Let's set our pivot to individual, actually to median point. We'll scale it up. So it's blocking the light now, which is what we want. Okay. Can even move this over a little bit. And then in edit mode, I'm going to add in couple of edge loops. And I'm going to select this face, and I'm going to hit X to delete the face. Alright. So now I can just select this edge loop, and we can kind of scale this down. And now it's cutting our light. So if we go into front view here, now we can shape that light however we want. So we can look at this. Okay, see we've got that kind of diagonal going on. So we can just play with just those 4 vertices and start getting something kind of interesting. Okay, maybe we want something like that. Or if we want to go wider, then I just have to select the spotlight in object mode. Come on, there it is. Oh, let me move this into light set 4. That as well. And I'll select the spotlight. Go back into here. And we'll set it to like 35. And we'll go 40. Just so we're covering that, and then I'll make up the difference just by moving this vertex in. Okay. Let me do something like that. And this is another thing, again, going back to the animation side of this. Could be a very interesting animated shot. Actually going to make that a little bit wider. So we've got this, and now if we start moving this left and right, there we go. Or maybe it's up and down as kind of a reveal. You know, it's even interesting, like right here before the light hits it, and we're just getting that bounce. Okay, and the light's doing some interesting. You can do some really cool stuff with light. It's one of my favorite things to play with. Alright, so we'll keep it there, and maybe we'll move it something like that. Okay, that's kind of interesting. So that'll be light set 4. I can move the empty into light set 4 as well. Okay, so that's it really for lighting. The last thing that I wanted to show real quick was just the Photoshop thing. So I'm going to go back to my original ground, and we're going to go back to light set 1, and I'm going back to frame 1. Okay. And I don't think I keyframed my camera position when I moved it. There we go. So I'm going to grab that, set a keyframe there. Now I can go back to frame 1, hit N. Not camera view. Okay. There we go. Ground 2. Alright, so let's say this is what you're going for. Let me turn that off, turn that on. Okay. So this is actually really pleasing to me just as is. But let's say you wanted to have more control but just wanted that shadow data. You only wanted to render the shadow but not the object underneath it. What you would do is, let me hide that so we can see a little bit better. We want to select this ground plane, and then in the object, it's not in the object, I gotta remember where it is because I always forget every time. It is in, it should be in here. There it is, in visibility. So we can go to the object preferences, or object properties, visibility, shadow catcher. So it's only going to render shadows, and it looks like nothing happened. But But now, if I hit render, and I need to make sure that I am rendering a PNG, so something with alpha. And I'll cover the rendering side of it more when we get to cameras and stuff, but just for demonstration purposes. Oh, I think it's rendering a lot of extra things here. So let me cancel that for a second. And make sure that, yeah, I only want this ground to be rendering. There we go. So I'll hit render here real quick. Let it go. You can see it's just rendering on a black void. It also renders a lot faster this way. But it's rendering on a black void. I'll zoom out here a little bit so we can see the whole thing. So take a second. I'll pause until it's done. Okay, so now that the render is done, I'm just going to image save as. I'm going to navigate, actually not to my projects folder. We're going to go into my Dropbox. Okay, we'll call this ray gun render test 1. That'll work. Save. So now we can go into Photoshop. And it's just a 1920 by 1080 blank canvas. I can go to my ray gun here, drag it in, and I forgot to do a thing. So what I forgot to do, everything is black and it's not supposed to be that way. So, cancel that. We're going to delete that layer. We can jump back into Blender. When you're rendering with transparency, there's a really important thing you need to do, and that is in the render options under film, you need to click transparent. Now you can see how it's going to render. That's what it's supposed to look like. I'm also going to change my render settings to GPU because that is faster, and I've got a powerful enough GPU that this will go pretty quick. So I'm going to hit render one more time. This should go considerably faster without having to render all the frames. Once it gets to the transparent stuff, you'll see it'll go through it real quick. So in a minute or two, I'll be back, and I'll show you what I actually meant to. Okay, so you can see the render is just finishing up. Last render took 3 minutes and 20 seconds. This one is almost done at 1 minute and 15, so almost 2 minutes faster, jumping to GPU rendering. So GPU rendering is generally faster depending on exactly what system you have. But I got a RTX 2080 in here, and so it goes pretty snappy. Alright, so now that I have that image save as, we can just overwrite that one. Make sure we have the alpha, save as. Now we can go back to Photoshop. There we go. Drag in our new render, and there we go. It's a little bit dark, and that is because I forgot to... There's a render setting that I forgot to check, and I don't remember what it is. Actually, I don't think it is dark. I think it's just seeing it on a white background is a bit jarring. So I probably could use a little bit more light. So you can do the normal Photoshop things, of course, just a little levels adjustment. Doesn't hurt. But because we have that transparency and we just have the shadows, I can now... We can add a solid color if we want, and any color that we choose. I'm gonna go like an orange. That's a bit much, but we do have that full control for anything. We could even do a gradient if we wanted to. Let's do something that isn't so obscene. Let's go with maybe this one. Okay, maybe something like that. You have those options and you have that freedom so you can do after the fact, whether you're doing a still render or full motion render. You have those options. So that's all I wanted to cover for lighting today. I will also say, as far as homework is concerned, I'll post it on D2L. But what I'm looking for next week is to have materials applied to everything. and then set up at least minimum 3 different lighting setups. And make sure you if you need to, set some keyframes so you can jump between them. But I want to see 3 different lighting setups. Make sure things are clearly named and numbered so that I can understand what it is when you submit, since you won't be here when I open them up. And also put comments in the D2L submission as well. But yeah, that's it. Thank you. I hope this format was helpful. If something was confusing, I realized my screencast keys are off for the second video, but if there is something that I can do to make these a little bit easier to understand, please let me know, and I can make adjustments moving forward. Thanks.